Tonight, the PM shelves his plans to fix the social care system again. What is the solution to the problem he promised he had sorted 2 years ago? And are they brave enough to do it? It was 10 years ago this month that Andrew Dilnot came up with his much-lauded care plan. We talked to him exclusively tonight and asked if an increase on national insurance is the way to go. Also tonight, Dominic Cummings says people should make their own minds up about whether Brexit was a success. What should that tell us? And where's Wally? Well, she's finally in space. We talked to one of the Mercury 13 who trained with her back in 1961. Hello, good evening. It probably shouldn't come as much of a surprise that a solution to social care has once again hit the buffers. Shortly after rumours of that proposed 1% rise to national insurance, the government's plan, we understand, was pushed back until autumn. Critics will point out this has been a delay not of weeks, but of decades. Solutions have been offered up, mulled and marred and ultimately ignored for many, many years. And it was the Prime Minister himself who memorably stood on the steps of Downing Street 2 years ago, promising his plan was ready to go. At its heart is the political question. What is the government prepared to charge us for our own care, and what are we prepared to pay? Tonight, we speak to the man who brought us the Dilnot report a full 10 years ago and is still waiting to see it implemented or rejected. First, let's catch up with our political editor, Nick. What is happening tonight in government then?
Well, that trio of ministers were close to a deal. As you say, Emily, it would mean a 1% increase in national insurance contributions and a cap on care costs of £50,000. That was the upper limit proposed by Andrew Dilnot, and now this delay. Now, there are two broad reasons for that delay. Firstly, there's the practical problem that these three ministers are hors de combat. Sajid Javid, he's got COVID, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are self-isolating because they came into contact with him. Now, you would need a massive operation to launch something like this. You can't do it from one of their sort of bunkers. You'd need a parliamentary statement, you'd need visit to care homes, and you'd need a big meeting of the 1922 committee. But there are also some political snags. As I understand it, talking to people who are familiar with Sajid Javid's thinking, he very much wanted to spend the summer thinking about social care. He's only just become health secretary. There's a slight feeling that maybe he was being bounced. That challenges the idea that it was him and Boris Johnson ganging up on Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor. The other political snag is that Rishi Sunak, a fiscal conservative, he instinctively wouldn't like tax rises, but I'm told under active consideration is the idea that yes, he would agree to this tax rise, but in exchange for that, the pension triple lock would no longer survive in its current form.
And what are the MPs or the backbenchers saying or not saying about this, Nick? What are you feeling?
Well, the problem with a delay like this is that it allows MPs to gnaw at the details. I was speaking to one senior figure. They're talking about a backlash from colleagues who are very upset that young people are going to have to pay for this. And this person is canvassing support for the idea that only people in their 40s and above would pay these extra national insurance contributions, and also people who have reached state retirement age and are still working, they're exempt from national insurance. They would have to pay under this idea. But I was speaking to one senior figure in government, and they're really worried that this delay on this issue means that the government is storing up over a very short period of time in the autumn a massive number of very significant decisions. There's COVID, there's the NHS catch-up, there's the moves towards net zero, there's the pension triple lock and social care. And this figure said to me, I will eat my hat if the Conservatives are at 35% in the polls by Christmas.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, that's, if you like, the politics of that decision or indecision to come. What about the economics of who actually pays and how? Here's Ben Chu.
Economically, this has been a grossly unequal pandemic from the point of view of different generations. Younger people have suffered the most in the labour market and seen their education severely disrupted. Older people, on the other hand, although by no means all, have seen the value of their homes and also stocks and shares soar. And some fear another economic wedge could be about to be driven hard between the generations. The government is reportedly looking at financing a long-awaited and much-needed overhaul of adult social care, £10 billion a year, by increasing national insurance contributions. So what's the problem with this approach?
The big thing people have noticed about national insurance contributions is that it's not charged on people over the state pension age, either on their earnings. So if you're working and earning money, you don't pay nix on that money, or on pension in receipt. So if you choose to pay for social care with nix, that's effectively a choice. That means we're going to pay for that social care based only on the working age. We already have in the system lower taxes on older people, so people over the state pension age, people working for their own businesses, and people who are getting investment incomes. And this would be a move that made that gap even bigger.
The Resolution Foundation points out that a 1p rise in personal national insurance contribution rates would mean a 21-year-old earning £20,000 a year paying £104 more in tax a year. A 21-year-old earning £50,000 would pay an additional £404, whereas a 66-year-old, even one earning as much as £50,000 a year, would pay zero extra. Now, it's important to note that not all adult social care spending goes on the elderly. Around half goes on people of working age with disabilities. Nevertheless, the intergenerational element of this tax idea cannot be ignored, especially because the consequence of any cap on personal care contributions underwritten by the government would be this. The idea is that it would leave untouched the housing wealth of those with large care costs. You've sort of seen, I suppose, firsthand this. Those who work with struggling young people are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen firsthand the difficulties that my younger relatives have had as they're wanting to start to move into work or move away from home, and it's just become impossible for them to do. I mean, there's often this belief that people won't notice a national insurance increase, but people aren't daft. They know what more money in their pay packet looks like, and they definitely know what it feels like. Any government that wants to rebuild our country after this terrible, terrible pandemic needs to make sure that young people are getting the support they need so that this recession doesn't create a really long-term burden for them.
Further evidence that younger generations sense what's going on came today in a Snap poll showing support for using national insurance hikes to pay for social care reforms is much lower among the under 50s than it is for those above that age. Among those aged 65 plus, those who wouldn't pay it, there was a 71% net approval. Among 25 to 49-year-olds, there was just 11% net support. Now, it's possible the government will decide to levy any increase in national insurance taxes to pay for this reform on pensioners too. That might defray the generational impact of this proposal, yet it would not eliminate it. And most experts have a simple message for the government on social care reform. Look for another way of paying for it.
That was Ben Chew. Well, joining us now, Sir Andrew Dilnott, who was commissioned to find a solution into long-term social care in 2011. Afterwards, we'll be joined by Viv Rayner from the National Care Forum and James Johnson, former pollster for Theresa May. But Sir Andrew, if we can start with you, and what we've heard today is that those reforms or that solution has been pushed back again by the sound of things, partly because of ministers self-isolating, partly because they clearly haven't come to a consensus yet. What is your response to what you're hearing?
Well, I suppose at one level, I don't mind too much exactly when things are announced. What I think matters most and is really critical is when things are actually done, when reforms are implemented. We have a social care system in this country that is something that as a nation we simply can't be proud of. We're failing people at their most vulnerable, and we need to sort it out. That's been necessary for decades. So exactly when the announcement's made, of course, I'd love it to be tomorrow. I'd love it to have been 10 years ago. I'm less worried about that. I'm more concerned about when reforms are actually implemented. And if this is a delay that just takes us to the early autumn, then we can still get extra money into the means-tested system. Next year, we can still get the more structural reforms done in a couple of years.
Well, let's talk about the how then. That 1% rise on national insurance was a suggestion being mooted. We've just heard about the potential generational gap that opens up when you've got 21-year-olds paying £400 and a 66-year-old paying zero. Would you reject that as the solution?
Well, that's really not the solution to the social care problem. The social care problem is about how we spend the money, not how we raise it. So this is a question about how the money is raised. I'm, in the end, more interested in how it's spent, what it's spent on, spending on the most vulnerable, spending on the workforce that have been neglected.
Until we've worked out actually how you raise it, which is the political conundrum at the heart of this, there won't be any solution.
I don't think it is the only. So I'll answer your question in a moment. I don't think it is the only political conundrum. I think the bigger political conundrums are actually about how it's spent. On how the money is raised, I think there's a strong case to be made for making sure that however the money is raised, those over retirement age, as well as those under retirement age, make a contribution. As Ben Shube pointed out, about half of social care spending is actually on people of working age, not on the elderly, and 3/4 of all of us will in the end need social care. But I certainly think it's entirely reasonable and appropriate that people over retirement age as well as under retirement age should pay towards this thing that will benefit many of us.
So pensioners should pay too?
I think pensioners who have enough income and wealth to pay should. One of the attractions of income tax, for example, is that income tax, which is paid by people regardless of their age, is paid strictly taking into account people's income position. And so I don't think poor pensioners should pay for this. Pensioners who have no income shouldn't be making a contribution. But I can't think of a very strong argument why a pensioner with a high income shouldn't contribute in much the same way as a person aged 50 with a high income.
Your suggestion 10 years ago was a cap, I think, of around 50,000 on individual contributions. I don't know whether that sum has changed. We saw with Theresa May her plan to allow for a floor, if you like, for people to pay for their care posthumously through property, went politically disastrously wrong for her and the party.
Yes, it did, and I think that's because it was in the end a misconceived idea. It failed to provide risk pooling for the population as a whole. It addressed one issue, which we also addressed in our report 10 years ago. We argued for a floor in the means-tested system to move from the position now where if you have wealth of more than £23,250, you get no help from the state. We suggested taking that up to a level of about £100,000. I think that's an important part of what needs to be done. But we do also need to produce a form of social insurance for the population as a whole. That's where the cap comes in.
But isn't
once
the cap
you've had
too blunt? I mean, I think it was Damien Green who said this is just too blunt an instrument. When you have a cap that is one set amount, then of course you're going to have other questions of inequality.
Well, there are certainly different ways of putting the social insurance in place, but 10 years on from our report, I don't think anyone has come up with a more effective and efficient way of doing it. I'm very happy if somebody can come up with a better way of delivering that social insurance to everybody, but I think that on the whole, there's pretty widespread agreement this is the right direction to travel in. That part of the proposals was in the manifestos of all three of England's major political parties in the run-up to the last election.
Sir Andrew, what have we lost from not having had a solution in this decade, in your opinion?
We've had generations of people who needed care and the families of people who needed care who have been let down. And we've had a huge workforce. We have 1.5 million people working in social care, as many as work in the NHS, and they've worked in a sector that has been vulnerable, fragile, where they've been poorly paid, where they haven't been properly trained. We've just not done a good enough job of looking after ourselves when we're at a time of our greatest need. And that's a massive political failure that's gone on for decades, and we really need to sort out now.
Sir Andrew Dilnot, thank you very much indeed. Let's pick up with Vic Rayner then from the National Care Forum, because you're at the coalface of this problem. Vic, what does this kind of delay, or any kind of delay, mean for you and the people within your care?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's just another series of frustrations, really. I mean, we've heard, for the last couple of years that this government was intending to reform social care, and we've heard this for decades, previous to that. So I think there's a lot of frustration around that. But I would absolutely agree with Sir Andrew that actually what we need to be talking about is what is the kind of social care system that we need to have. Prior to this government, we had 2.5 years of discussing a green paper which was intended to outline what social care should look like. We haven't ever had that, so we haven't had the proper debate about what kind of social care we need now, and absolutely, most importantly, what we're going to need for the future.
Why do you think we're sort of squeamish about this?
Well, I think part of the challenge is exactly as you showed in the clip. Whenever we start to talk about spending money on social care, people start to raise issues of fairness and intergenerational burden and all of these kind of things. But I don't think we ever get to the nub of the debate, really. So if we want to talk about fairness, we've currently got a system that's rife with cross-subsidy, that has 1.6 million people waiting for care because the eligibility criteria is so high. We've got 8 million unpaid carers who are not getting the assessments that they need. Lots of people who are wanting to live independently in the community and can't get the care and support they need. And that's the discussion we need to have with the general public, not one which politicians have made so narrow about people having to sell their homes for the cost of care. And I'm not belittling that problem at all. But once you start to make it into such a narrow sort of cohort of people who people think will be supported, then you're not going to get a proper debate about social care, and it affects all of us.
James, where is the general public on this one now? Have we shifted?
I think we have shifted. I mean, if we look over the last 10 years, back in 2009, people generally said they wanted to see spending cuts to sort of fund some of these elements of the NHS and social care in other areas. Now that has really moved on to tax increases. Now, I expect that one of the elements of the government's thinking about this 1% national insurance rise is that in the research I've done, I'm sure in the research that the government's seeing in terms of when they go out and speak to the public, is that it is quite popular. Yes, it's more popular with older people because they don't have to pay it, but it's also popular amongst younger people. And in the focus groups that I've done, people feel that national insurance is fairer. They feel it's more likely to go to the NHS and social care, and therefore they feel like their money is less likely to be wasted. So those political considerations, I'm sure, are behind this decision.
You just heard Andrew Dilnot say he thought that older, wealthier people, those who could afford to pay for it, should be included. Do you think the government would take that to the people? Would that be electorally too dangerous?
I think that if it were targeted, I think one of the key things the public always sort of look for in this is a sense that perhaps the people who have a little bit more earnings, of higher income, are paying more in. So that's certainly an element. I think the danger is if some Tory MPs are talking about the idea of a tax just for over 40s. Again, we tested that when I was at Downing Street and since. And the public really recoil against that. They feel like it's their parents and grandparents being punished for their hard work throughout their life. Even 18 to 24-year-olds are heavily opposed to that policy. So I think in responding to the MPs over the summer, as they get closer to the autumn, the government also needs to make sure they don't go too far the other way, end up punishing the old rather than the young.
Vic, how do you plan for this? I mean, within care homes, how do you actually plan for not really knowing whether there is or there will be a strategy, or you could see a strategy implemented very quickly?
Well, and I think that's the problem, because social care is a long-term challenge, and what we've had repeatedly from governments is very, very short-term fixes. So it's really difficult for organisations to plan, and particularly really difficult for organisations to think about how they innovate and change. There's a massive digital revolution that's needed within the social care sector, but that requires investment. There are new models of care that we know work really well to support people to live independently, particularly people with dementia, that work really well, and we're not able to invest in those buildings, invest in those services, and really importantly invest in that workforce. And Sir Andrew mentioned that there's 1.6 million people working within social care, and yet, most of those who are working on the front line are on minimum wage, and that's a disgraceful position for the sector to be in.
Really, that must be tough. And just lastly to you, James, I mean, is there a chance that Boris Johnson is hearing the murmurings of disquiet from his MPs, but actually the wider public is much more where the sort of spending would be?
I think that probably is likely. I think this is one of those issues where there is a big disjunction between where the MPs are and where the public are. I mean, let's look back to March at the budget, where the Chancellor did announce tax rises. He announced a corporation tax rise, and he announced a freeze in personal allowances. In advance to that, MPs were very nervous, very worried, saying it was going to be the end of them forever. They were breaking their pledges to their constituents. Actually, the Chancellor got that through, and the public actually welcomed it and found it popular. I expect we might actually end up seeing something similar happen here.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for coming in. None of us will ever forget the haunting, searing images of Grenfell Tower. It was one of the worst tragedies of modern British history. But since then, across the country, there have been other fires in other blocks of flats which have received less attention, many of which were built far more recently, and the occupants would have thought with the best and latest fire safety standards. They too were let down by a failed regulatory regime. And in the latest of our reports on the building safety crisis and the fallout it's leaving on leaseholders saddled with debt and nightmares, Lewis Goodall has been investigating.
I remember waking up and seeing the flame and just being momentarily paralysed.
You couldn't believe it, like how that fire could rapidly develop to a blaze, like full blaze, and then, engulfing this whole 23 flats in about maybe, let's say, 15 minutes.
I don't think we realised until we left the property how sort of black and how much smoke we'd probably inhaled in just that couple of minutes.
The scar on my finger from banging the door so hard, trying to make sure that everyone was out of the building, because all I could remember was thinking about what happened in Grenfell.
Often when we talk about the problem of building safety defects, it is a hypothetical, a might be, a could have been, a nightmare not yet realised. But for the former residents of Richmond House in southwest London, it is crushingly real. In 2019, all 23 sets of shared ownership leaseholders quickly lost their homes to flame, despite the efforts of 125 firefighters. 2 years later, their old block is little more than a fence. Rebuilding hasn't even begun.
It's a strange feeling. We haven't been here for quite a long time, so with COVID and everything, coming back now, it's such a beautiful day. You can kind of remember why we first kind of chose this place.
Why you wanted to live here in the first place?
Yeah, like it's like a little paradise.
The Hamptons development in Worcester Park is a set of luxury flats and homes in leafy Kingston, developed by one of Britain's biggest developers, Barclays. Construction was completed in 2010-11. As befits the name, it has a distinctly American air. But the opulence of the homes didn't stop the flames that night. Indeed, defective building work appears to very much have been part of the problem. An independent fire report conducted by Probyn and Meyer highlighted a lack of functioning fire cavity brakes designed to slow the spread of fire within the walls of buildings. The report says, in Richmond House, the cavity barriers that were fitted were defective. They were too small to close the cavity, and they would have contributed nothing to control of the fire. The defects in the cavity barrier installation appears to be the result of errors in the design. This being the case, it would seem that the building likely could not have adhered to the building regulations in place at the time. We asked the developers directly to take issue with this. They did not. Unlike so many other buildings, this fault was not picked up by the deeply flawed building safety regime. Leaseholders who bought the property in good faith remain incredulous.
We were surprised, like whole chain of this signing had gone through, and then everybody had signed off to be safe, and it cannot happen because these are not naive people, these are professionals, and they should have noticed these things, and then there must have been some engineers or technical experts involved. And how did they sign this thing? And this is not any other country, this is UK. So we expect things to be an example to the other, rest of the world.
Initially, the developers, Barclays, appeared to accept the fault and said they would act accordingly. This is an audio recording of a meeting held with the leaseholders in November 2019. Then Barclays chairman, the late Anthony Pidgley, said this.
I don't know how to say sorry to you. I founded this business because I believe decent doing decent things, and we failed that. We did miss that fast. Sorry, but we will be taking responsibility.
And yet Barclays has since resiled from this position. The freeholder has offered to buy the leaseholders' share of the properties back, something most of the leaseholders have rejected, partly as a result of the valuation offered and the trauma they've endured.
I'm still paying my mortgage every month, but I don't have the benefit of the use of my home. So to get redress for that, and to get redress for the fact that I've lost everything I ever owned, and for the other emotional and mental turmoil that has resulted for me personally and for the other residents as a result of being in that fire and the loss of our home.
In a statement, Barclays told us,
"The cause of the fire was never identified, but the building's means of escape performed correctly to allow everyone safely to evacuate in the middle of the night without physical injury. Investigations are ongoing into how the fire spread as it did,
Our approach to compensation and support has remained entirely consistent throughout this process, with general compensation having already been paid on an ex gratia basis, together with a contribution to lawyers' fees.
Richmond House is instructive for two reasons. The government is only offering support for buildings with cladding problems which are 18 metres or over, and have indicated that they think shorter buildings should be less of a problem in terms of fire safety. But Richmond House was only about 10 metres, but burned down it still did.
OK, we won't take it to court.
And secondly, because these leaseholders are doing what the government wants leaseholders to do, to take developers to court.
This new change in the law, I think, does put new cards in the hands of the leaseholders so they can take action.
Consider that in Worcester Park we have a case which many people would say is an example, a clear example of a developer being in the wrong. We know from the fire safety report that the fire cavity brakes were defective. That being the case, it is likely that the building wasn't compliant with regulations. It was within the statute of limitations. The building has quite literally burnt down, and yet the leaseholders are still finding the legal process taking on such a big company to be fraught with difficulty. And many will say that if they're finding it difficult, then what hope is there for everybody else?
Richmond House shows you what can happen when a building regime fails. It's a system which has been failing for decades. And the scary part is how many other buildings in how many other places have these exact same internal problems. And in many cases, those who live there don't even know it yet.
Lewis Goodall with our report there. Dominic Cummings has told the BBC that no one on earth knows whether Brexit was a good idea for Britain. The man who's credited with driving through the Vote Leave campaign says he personally regards leaving the EU as a good thing, but that it may have been a mistake. This evening, he said the £350 million slogan plastered onto the side of a bus was just a deliberate bid to drive their Remain opponents crazy. Well, tonight, in an hour-long interview, he discussed his disillusion with the Prime Minister, his infamous trip at the height of the pandemic to test his eyesight at Barnard Castle, and his relationship with those in power. Here's a little bit of what he said.
Even you are still not sure if Brexit was a good idea.
I think anyone who says they're sure about questions like that has got a screw loose, whether you're on the Remain side or our side. I think one of the reasons why we won is precisely because in Vote Leave we didn't think that we're definitely right and Remainers are all idiots or traitors or anything else. We never thought like that then and still don't, and I don't now. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that Brexit was a mistake and that history will prove that. Of course, it's reasonable for some people to think that. I honestly don't know what sort of person you'd be if you didn't have a view like that. There are many people I know personally who I'd much prefer to see in number 10, but that wasn't a practical possibility for me. I also thought that precisely because Boris knows that in lots of ways he obviously shouldn't be Prime Minister, he knows that he needs help, he knows that he needs to bring in various people to help him. That also provides an opportunity to push the country in a much more positive direction.
What you're saying, he was so useless that you were able to get him to do what you wanted?
I mean, partly, yes. Or that he didn't know what he was doing, but he did know that he needed help.
That was Dominic Cummings speaking to Laura Kuenssberg this evening. Well, we invited the government on the programme and the Labour front bench. They both declined. Joining me now, Theresa May's former Chief of Staff and Conservative peer Gavin Barwell and the Labour peer Helena Kennedy. Welcome to you both. Can I start with you, Helena? What did you make of what you heard this evening? You can pick up where you choose.
Well, you know, lots of people, I can imagine what the headlines will be tomorrow. I mean, I certainly think that the press will all say, of course, you know, why would anybody consider him a credible witness when he was certainly dishonest about what he did when he went to Durham and his own lies about all of that. But actually, I think that many of the things that he said were truthful. And I do think, I mean, it's one of the things that you do as a lawyer. You have to assess what the bulk of the thing is. And I think that he's giving an account that many of us know is truth. The truth, which is that this was a capture. This was, you know, it's like state capture. This was capture of the Conservative Party. He said, do we let the Tory party go down the pan or do we take it over? And that's what he and his pals have done.
So did it make you, sorry to interrupt, does it make you more sympathetic then to Boris Johnson? Do you sort of think, you know, why did he have this man? No.
I'm sorry, I don't feel sorry for Boris, because I think the truth is that Boris is in many ways incompetent. I do think he's chaotic. I do think that on many things he's clueless and unsuited to high office. I actually think that Cummings is right about all of that, and they knew that from the beginning. And Emily, let me tell you, if you spend time in the company of Conservatives, and I'm not talking about Remainers, Brexiteers too, they know that Boris is not able to do this job, but they know that
I guess it does. It does sort of, you know, sort of suit the purposes of Labour to sort of say, well, he's a liar and he's incompetent. I mean, you can't actually end up with you know, suddenly he tells the truth and suddenly he doesn't tell the truth, and you know, 1 minute
it's
he's.
Not like that. Emily, it's not like that. I've spent my life in the courts. Yes, of course, as a defence lawyer, I would be taking Dominic Cummings apart and saying that he is not a person that you can rely upon because he's not credible. But he also has been very close to the workings of power, and I think he's told the absolute truth about the fact that Boris went to him and said, "I need you," because Boris was frightened of what the prospect was.
Let me bring in.
Cummings had won for him.
OK, let me bring in Gavin Barwell. I wonder if you think this is actually quite helpful for Boris Johnson. We've heard a lot from Dominic Cummings over the last few weeks and months, whether it's in the select committees or, you know, at length, very publicly in the tweets and the blogs. Does it just get easier and easier for the Prime Minister to dismiss what Cummings is saying?
So I don't think you could possibly call it helpful, Emily. But I think you're right that in terms of the general public, Dominic Cummings is probably one of the least credible people to attack the Prime Minister. The public's view of him was shaped by the Barnard Castle incident, and I think a lot of people are not going to take a huge amount of notice of what was said, even though I agree with Helena that there was a mixture of some things that ring true and some things that felt like revenge served piping hot.
It talked about the bus slogan. He basically said that the £350 million slogan on the side of the bus was a sort of wind-up mechanism, and it did wind people up on the Remain side, and they called it out. I mean, I wonder where you think that leaves either Brexiteers who sort of bought it or Remainers who fought it. Gavin?
I think in political campaigns, it's always the case that you try to get the argument in the campaign on an issue that you want to talk about. And I think he ran a very effective, I don't agree with him, but I think he ran a very effective Leave campaign. And he got the debate focused on the amount of money that the UK was contributing to the EU each year, which is where he wanted it. So, you know, on that point, I think he was telling the truth about what the objective was.
Yeah, and I guess, Helena, you know, ultimately, he was a political strategist. He was a campaigner, and to sort of attribute anything more ideological maybe is wrong. I mean, he sounded like a man who could conceive that there would be doubts in a lot of people's minds, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing.
I think that you're putting too innocent an interpretation on this man. This man has, for a very long time, had a purpose. He is a disruptor. This is the politics of disruption. He actually does. He said it very clearly. He wants to take down Whitehall, the normal institutions of government, which Britain is looked to from around the world as having been great at. He wants that all to be pulled apart. He said that you know, the Tory party had to either go down the pan or do we take it over and go in there. And Team Brexit did that. And of course, Boris knew. Boris is a campaigner. People like this cheeky chappy stuff. And I'm sure that the public won't be interested in what we've just watched. But the point is that their own party, the Conservative Party, know there's a truth in this and they know it's been captured. And what will happen, let me tell you, is that they're now rushing through a bill to make sure that an election can be called, not having to wait for 5 years. And they will have Boris fight that election earlier, and they will then dump him. And Boris will be happy because he'll go off and earn a lot of money. But the real problem is that he'll have left a lot of disruption behind him. And we know
Gavin, Helena's taken the crystal ball she's taken it quite far into the future and run with it. I wonder if you think that voters or the public will dismiss what they've seen tonight. Will it have a lasting impact? Will anything change?
I don't think this interview is going to change anything in terms of the general public. But that doesn't mean that what he said wasn't very important. And, you know, when we get the public inquiry finally into the pandemic, some of these issues are clearly going to be front of stage then. But
I mean, you don't, for example, look at what he said to the Select Committee about Matt Hancock and then look up at the fact that Matt Hancock, you know, is now out of his job.
I wouldn't necessarily equate those two things. There's not a causal link between the two of them. So, what he said is very important in a number of regards. As I said, I think some of the testimony is powerful. But to me, the most extraordinary thing, I spent 2 years of my life as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. It's an amazing job, but it takes over your entire life. And the idea that someone would do that job whilst believing that the person they're working for isn't a fit person to be Prime Minister, I find utterly incredible. And to me, that was the most powerful thing about this interview. You've got someone who is openly, brazenly admitting that he put someone into number 10 who he doesn't think is up to doing the job of Prime Minister.
Gavin Barwell, Helena Kennedy, thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us. A trip into space for an 82-year-old woman was always going to be an extraordinary moment. But for Wally Funk, it was something else. She was a pilot denied the chance to go into space 6 decades ago, despite her astronautical training, because she was a woman. Today, she travelled with Jeff Bezos and returned saying she wanted to go again and fast.
I felt great. I was just laying down and I was going into space. I've been waiting a long time to finally get it up there. And I've done a lot of astronaut training through the world, Russia, America, and I could always beat the guys on what they were doing because I was always stronger and I've always done everything on my own. Hi, Mom! I love it.
Well, in 1961, Wally Funk and 12 other women went through testing to see if they would be good candidates to go to space. You heard what happened. They were. And they're often called the Mercury 13. But the US government shut the programme down. Despite the training, not one was allowed to go. Now, just 2 of the original Mercury 13 are still alive. Wally Funk and Janora Jessen, who, I'm delighted to say, joins us now from her home in Idaho. Janora, I cannot imagine what it was like seeing Wally go up and return today for you.
It was interesting watching Wally. She just is having a marvelous time, and I was so happy she finally got to go.
Was there a little bit of you in there? I mean, were you sort of thinking, what if that had been me all these decades on?
Oh, I really haven't worried about that. I've said before, often when I'm flying an airplane, I say, why me, God? Why did I get lucky enough to get to be a pilot and be in aviation and fly in this airplane? So it hasn't really worried me a lot about missing out on anything. I've just had a wonderful time flying airplanes, and more power to Wally. It was really important for her. She wanted so much to go into space. She had been thinking about that for years and years. So I can really just have a bunch of appreciation and happiness for her that she has fulfilled that wish.
Will you, Janora, take us back to that moment in 1960 or the 1960s when the programme was shut down? You'd all done this training. You had proved yourself. As we heard from Wally, she was the best in the group. She was one of the strongest. And then I think it was John Glenn who talked about, you know, the natural order of things being space was only right for men. What was that like?
Well, first of all, you used the word training. We didn't have any training. We had a lot of testing is what we were doing. And we had not had any promises, although we had a lot of beliefs that we were going to have some some opportunities to do more than watch the men fly. So, but we were flying. But at any rate, I moved on in my life, and I was fortunate enough to fly airplanes for an aircraft manufacturer in every state. All the different airplanes that they produced, had a wonderful time. So I have not been embittered or responsible for being unhappy that I didn't do this or that. I've done some great flying.
You don't sound bitter at all. You sound like you've had an absolute dream of a life with all you've done. But I wonder what you think was the fallout, if you like, of that decision 6 decades ago to stop women participating in space programs. Do you think it had a longer effect?
Well, it's too bad, because there were a lot of women who were able to go ahead in aviation and in what the men were doing at that time. And when they finally did have female astronauts, those women are so talented and have so many skills and different skills in aviation. And about all you can say is, well, it's about time.
And you've remained friends with Wally, I think, much of your life. Will you manage to see her, or will you talk to her after her trip?
Yes, Wally and I grew up together. Really, I'm 2 years older than Wally, but we were both flying for universities, 2 different universities, and we had students. We were flight instructors. And so we saw a lot of each other, and we're still in contact now. And I was fortunate enough to get a great job at an aviation manufacturer. And Wally went her way, and she was still flying also. Wally was very disappointed about the space program, that she did not go into the space program, even though we had taken a lot of tests. We had passed a lot of tests. It bothers her a lot that she didn't get to go forward. I think the reason that I was not inclined to be unhappy about it is because I had a really good job at Beach Aircraft Corporation. I was happy with it. I was doing some great flying and flying all over the country, and so it didn't really.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
we'll have to wrap up there, but it's great that it had what sounds like a very happy ending for both of you, and for Wally particularly this evening, with all that has been achieved. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real privilege to have you on the show tonight. And that is all we have time for this evening. I'll be back tomorrow. Do join us then. Bye-bye.